rather the surmising of the Chachamim, and I'll point that out at an appropriate place. But what is important is we'll see that they were familiar in dealing with some of these items. Okay. Beginning with our year of learning, Dr. Paul Koningsberg, in memory of his brother, Dr. Sam Koningsberg, Shimon Reuven ben Labush, and Ed Goldberg's cousin, Nissen Hara Nissen ben Fardosa. Paul and Bob Bromberg, in memory of their dear friend, Julian Smith, Yehuda ben Yisrael. Baal Man, in memory of her family murdered in the Holocaust. Harav Tzvi Hirsch ben Shlomo Yaakov, Sarah bat Ephraim, Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Ephraim ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Adia bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Miriam bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Pesel bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shalom ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shlomo Yaakov ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shmuel ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. The many friends of Dr. Marvin Blush, Moshe Shalom ben Yitzchak Halevi, friends of Toby Paris, Saratova bat Yisrael Dov, friends of Malka Levi, Malka bat Yosef, friends of Avi Gitler, Avram Meir ben Shimon, Cheryl Sher, her children and grandchildren, in memory of her uncle, founding member of BRS, Dr. Israel Brook, Yisrael ben Harav Akiva, Marcia Federbush and family, in memory of her husband, Dr. Oriel Paul Federbush, Oriel ben Harav Shimon, friends of Joe Wolf, Yosef ben Chaim, Sharon and Fred Lisker, their family and many friends, in memory of her dear mom, Harriet Friedman, and Edel Bas Yaakov. A Month of Learning by Ruth Burian, Judy and Edward Boyne, in memory of Ruth and Judy's mother, Hadassah bat Azriel Zelig Miriam, and father Yitzchak ben Yosef Esther. Jill and Perry Meltzer, in memory of her father Yaakov ben Yosef. B. Pizer, in memory of her mother Razel bas Shammai, and stepfather Avram Michal ben Shmuel Halevi. Josh and Carol Sanborn, in memory of his mother Chiena bas Aryeh Leib, and his father Shmuel Aryeh ben Baruch. Mel and Haran Haller, in memory of his mother Fega bas Yaakov. A Week of Learning by Sandra and Marty Levine, and Brenda and Ed Parver, in memory of Sandra and Brenda's mother Chaya Hudel bas Yaakov Leib, and their father Betzalel ben Avraham Yehuda. The children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of Esther Shepatovsky, in memory of Esther Riva bas HaChazan Betzalel. Sid Peres, in memory of his mother Yehuda bat Tzvi, and his father Chaim ben Aharon Kohen. Today being the 23rd, a day of learning by Zahava Baum, in memory of her father Naftali ben Harav Pesach Chaim Menachem, by Arlene and Norman Glick, in memory of her father Yitzchak ben Yaakov, and that is it. May the Shamas have an Aliyah, Krank Rafir Velti Yashir Hashem Taliyah, and L'chol B'nai Israel a good gebench Diyar. Okay, so I hinted that the part of the Gemara is going to deal with scientific or quasi-scientific issues. But we don't get to that at the outset. We'll get to that a little bit further down the Amud. So we left off, excuse me, with our discussion, okay, of clarifying what we saw was the Torah statement of Tameh and Rachok being the exceptions for Koret, and whether that implied both the first Pesach and the second Pesach. And then we dealt with the question whether it was simply Tameh Mace, or was there other situations of being Tameh. Okay, and we saw a Braita that discussed with it in much detail, and then we went on, okay, to talk about Derech Rechoka. How far was it? Things of that nature. Okay, So I'm going to pick up, okay, where we saw, okay, that sort of on the bottom of Tzadi Gimel Amud Beis, remembering that Ula's response was he doesn't have a problem because he said that it was one statement was for somebody, the Derech Rechoka applied to somebody who was Tahor, and the other statement was for somebody who was Tameh. Derech Rechoka didn't apply to that person. And he claimed, said Ula, on the top of Tzadi Dalid, right, that Rav Yehuda also doesn't have a problem. Tameh sheretz rachmana dechia. We read that if somebody is tameh because of a sheretz, in other words, not just tumas meis, that the Torah put it off, where it says ish ki yeh tameh lenefesh. Okay, milo askinan shechal shvi'i shelo liot be'erev Pesach, that his seventh day came out right on Erev Pesach, the 14th of Nisan. Va'afilu hachi amar rachmana lidchei. And even in that case, according to the Torah, Rav Yehuda could say, no, that's also a deferment to bring your Korban Pesach on the 14th of Iyar. Okay? And that's where we left off. Okay? Now, let's come back now to this issue of some of the measurements. Okay? We claimed that the Gemara was telling us that if you were beyond a certain distance, and that's the page on Tzadi Gimel Amud Beis, seemed to imply if you were more than 15 mil, that was the definition of Derech Rechoka. Okay? But the Gemara is going to now bring to us a number of challenges, okay, to this, say, supposed definition. First one comes in this current Braita. Tanu Rabbanan, 5 lines down from the top in Tzadi Daled Amud Aleph. Haya omeid chutz l'modein. Let's assume that there were individuals, okay, that were outside of Modein, but closer to the city, okay, to that city, right? V'yachol likanes b'susim u'bepradim. And instead of walking, they would travel the distance of the 15 mil to Jerusalem, either by horse or by mule. Yehol yehei chayav. It's possible that we might think that if they don't get there by midday, when they start slaughtering the Korban Pesach, that they then would be chayav kores. Talmud lomar ubaderech lo haya. But the pasuk says, and on along the way, they're not there. Vahala haya baderech. But these are considered to be along the way, and therefore it doesn't apply to them. Haya omed lifnim min hamodein. Let's say they were well outside of the city of Modein, and well along the way, fairly close to Yerushalayim. Ve'en yachol likanes mipnei gmalim ukronot u'me'akvot oto. But they would not be able to enter Jerusalem and the Azarah before the beginning of slaughter midday because of the amount of traffic, because of the number of camels and wagons that are delaying them to get in time. Yechol lo yehei chayav. We might have thought in that situation they would not be obligated or punishable by karet. Talmud lomar ubaderech lo haya. But again, it says on the road if they're not there. V'harei lo haya baderech. But in this case, okay, they are not considered on the road because they are, in essence, perhaps either just outside Yerushalayim, or even in the environs, let's say suburbs almost of Yerushalayim, but have not reached the Azara. Now, that's one case. So, problem with that definition of derech rechoka. Amar Rava, says Rava, the following: Shita alfe parse. And here we're going to get to this extensive discussion now of distances and other aspects of travel, because we had said earlier that we were making the time frame not from sunrise, okay, or not from dawn until sunrise, which we said could be a person on foot could cover in 5 miles, but from sunrise to midday. And that was our 15 meal, okay? Because the rest of the day, to make up the other 20, 15 would be from midday to sundown, and then another 5 from sundown to the time the stars came out. Okay, so we're now going to question that again definition. Okay, again with another statement. Amar Rava. So Rava says, Shita alfe parse, 6,000 parsecs. Have Alma was the world. Vesumcha drakia alpha parse. And the thickness of the heaven, of the firmament, is 1,000 parsecs. Since we were getting into distances, Rava suggested this statement. Chada Gemara, one we learn from tradition, v'chada Savara, and one we learn from logic. Savarla, ki hada amar Rava bar Chana amar Rabbi Yochanan. This seems to tell us that Rava was of the same opinion as Rava bar Chana, who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan the following: Kama mahalech adam benoni biyom. How much can a person travel, the average person walk in a day? Asara parsaot, 10 parasangs. Now that's quite different than what we saw before, because the other statement seemed to imply that during at least daytime, one could walk much more, namely 30. Now, me'alot hashachar, here's what he's saying, from the time of dawn, v'ad neitz hachama, okay, he would walk from dawn until the rising of the sun, chamesh milin, 5 meal. And remember, we said 1 meal is equal to 4 parasangs, right? So 5 meal would be 20. Mishkiat hachama ad seta kochavim, from the setting of the sun until the stars come out, chamisha milin. That's 5 meal, which again would be 20 parsecs. Okay, nimtza. Okay, based on this, he said that if we take 20 and 20 away from 40, right, that leaves us, okay,
0.
Well, that would leave us 0, but the implication is if he can do 20 in the morning, 20 there, right? So it means that the distance that was calculated before is incorrect. Okay? So here he says, he continues, okay? Nimtza ovyo shel rakia echad mishisha bayom. Okay, that would seem to tell us that the thickness of the firmament is 1/6 of what is the count during the day. Okay? So that's where he gets his number 10. Meitive. But this is challenged Rabbi Yehuda Omer, by Rabbi Yehuda. Ovyo shel rakia, the thickness of the firmament, echad me'asara b'yom, is 1/10 of what a person could travel in a day. Teda, and you should know, kama mahalech adam benoni bayom, how much could an average person walk for a day? Eser parsaot. He could walk 10 parsaot. Okay? Now, that would be equal to basically 2.5 meal. Ume'alot hashachar ad netzachama, according to this view, okay, from the dawn until sunrise, arba'at milim, he would walk 4 meal, okay, which would be 16 parsecs. Mishkiat hachama vi'ad seta kochavim, and from the setting of the sun until the stars come out, arba'at milim, another 4 meal, okay, which would be 16 parsecs. Nimtzeit ovyo shel rakia, that would imply that the thickness of the firmament, echad me'asara b'yom, is 1/10 of what the day is. Therefore, tiyuvta de Rava, that would be a proof text against what Rava just said, okay? And also tiyuvta de Ola, and a proof text against what Ola said about the 15. Tiyuvta. Indeed, that seems to be a valid proof against them. So that's one brighter. Now we're going to come to another situation. Lema tiyuvte tihavu tiyuvta de Rabbi Yochanan. Shall we say this is also a proof text to our previous braita that was said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan? Amarlach, he would say to you, Ana biyamama hu da'amre. I was talking about what one could walk during daylight. V'Rabbanan hu dekatau. And those rabbis who were supposedly quoting me, they were the ones who made the error. Deka chashvan, dekadman v'chashucha. Because they already considered and included what came before daylight and what came darkness afterwards. Lema, let us say then, tiyuvta the Rabbi Chanina. So let's say then perhaps that this statement is a proof text against what Rabbi Chanina said. No, that's not the case. Why? Because when we cited the example of using the Torah in the previous Amud, when Rabbi Chanina said, remember, I myself saw the distance, right, between Sodom and Tzoar, okay? And he claimed that what was the situation? That he could base it on psukim, that it said that the angels came to Sodom and pushed the people out, pushed Lot out, and that then they got to Tzoar in time for the sun rising, okay? Claiming that therefore that was 5, right, meal, okay? So he's going to say, no, that's not a proof text against his statement. Why? Because the pasuk that he cited said via itu shani, that the angels hastened them, okay? And therefore it's different. Namely, that they walked a distance of what would be 5 meal, okay, in the amount of time that one would walk 4 meal. Tashma. So now that answered that issue. Now we get a new braita, okay? And now we're going to get into a little geography. Okay? Let's say the following Braita tells us. Mitzrayim haya arba me'ot parsa. Egypt now was 400 parsangs. Arba me'ot parsa. Okay? 400 by 400 parsangs. So it's as if Egypt was almost like a square. Okay? Umitzrayim echad mishishim bakush. And Egypt was 1/60th of Kush, Kush being Africa. Ukush echad mishishim ba'olam. And Africa was considered as saying 1/60th of the world. Ve'olam echad mishishim began Eden. And the world was 1/60th of the Garden of Eden. Echad mishishim ba'Eden. Okay, 1/60th of Eden. Okay, so the Garden of Eden was 1/60th, Vegan, Echad mishishim ba'Eden, and the garden itself was 1/60th of Eden. Ve'Eden, Echad mishishim b'Gehinam, and Eden was 1/60th of Gehenna. Nimtza kol ha'olam kulo, ki kisui k'deira l'Gehinam. And that would imply that the entire world was like a pot cover underneath, of which underneath was Gehinnom. So you're talking a sort of an idea that the planet is already round, okay, and that there was certainly something underneath it, okay? Now, Tiyuvta. And therefore, that's a proof text against what we saw before. Now we come up with another Braita. Tashma. Listen to the following Braita, the Tana the Bei Eliyahu, which was taught in the Academy of Eliyahu. Rav Natan Amaya. There's a long discussion, by the way, just as an aside, whether this Eliyahu was the name of another Tana or whether there's was an academy named after Eliyahu Hanavi. Okay? In any case, it's Rabbi Natan who tells us the following. Again, more geography. Kol hayishuv kulo tachet kochav echad. Now we're going from geography to, I guess, astronomy. He says all of the inhabited areas are under a single star. Teda, Shahare Adam notain eino bekochav echad. No, he says, that a person can look at this particular star, right? Bekochav echad. Holech lemizrach, omed kenegdo. If he goes to the east, he can still turn and face, standing facing this star. Okay? La'abaru chot ha'olam. From any of the four directions of the world, omed kenegdo. One would see this star standing opposite him. Okay? Miklal, from this we learn the general observation. The kol hayushiv, excuse me, kulo tachet kochav echad yoshev. That the entire inhabited part of the world is under this single star, and that's also a proof text, okay, against the previous measurements. Now, another Braita, okay, even more into astronomy. Tashma, listen to the following. Agla, which is Ursa Major, right, the constellation of stars, Ursa Major. Ve'akrav, and that's Scorpio, the constellation of stars. So he says, Agla b'tzafon, Ursa Major is in the north, and Scorpio b'darom is in the south. V'kol hayishuv kulo, and all the inhabited area, eino yoshev ela bein Agla la'akrav. is only to be found then between Ursa Major and Scorpio. L'chol hayishuv kulo eino hava ela sha'a achat bayom. And all the inhabited area is only considered like 1 hour of the day. She'ein chama nichneset liyishuv, because the sun doesn't begin to enter the area that's inhabited. Ela sha'a achat bayom. It's as if only 1 day, 1 hour per day. So in other words, the amount of time that the sun shines in the firmament, over the inhabited area, is like only one part of the day. Right? Teda. Know, therefore, he says, shebechamesh, for example, that at 5 in the afternoon, chama b'mizrach, the sun is in the east. Ubesheva, in other words, at the 5th hour of the day, if we start the day, let's say at 6 in the morning, just for discussion, by the 5th hour of the day, let's say that would be 11, the sun is still in the east. Ubesheva, and by the 7th hour of the day, in other words, it's past midday already, chama b'ma'arav, the sun has already moved to the west. Chatzi sheish v'chatzi sheva, half the 6th hour and half the 7th hour. Chama omedet b'rosh kol adam. That's when the sun stands directly above any person. In other words, midday to Yufta. And therefore that also becomes a proof text against what was said for the measure of the firmament. Now, another Braita. Tashma da'amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The following. Ma tshuva hashivato bat kol oto rasha b'sha'ah she'amar e'ele al b'matei av adma le'elyon. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Take a quick drink. What was it? He says that a divine voice said to that same wicked person, the son of a wicked person, in other words, Nimrod, who wanted to build the Tower of Babel in order to get up to heaven, right? When he said, E'ele al b'matei av edameh le'elyon, right? To go up to heaven. Yatzta bat kol va'amra lo, a voice came out of heaven and said to him, Rasha ben Rasha. Right? Yeah, Rasha ben Rasha, ben Beno shel Nimrod harasha. Shehimrid et kol ha'olam kulo alai b'malchuto. That he caused all of the people, in other words, to rebel against Hashem, during Nimrod, during his reign. Right? So in other words, how is it possible to say that he could build something ever to reach the firmament, to heaven, if it was supposedly so high? Right? Kama shnotav shel adam. How many years are of a person's life? Shivim shana. We say there's 70 years. Ve'im b'gvurot, and if with God's, graciousness, in this case, shmonim shana, 80 years. Shne'amar, citing the pasuk, Yemei shnotenu bahem shivim shana, ve'im b'gvurot shmonim shana. Now, min haaretz l'rakia, from land to the firmament, mahalech chamesh me'ot shana. It would take one 500 years. Va'ovyo shel rakia, and the thickness of the firmament, Mahalech Hashem Chamesh Me'ot Shana. That would take another going 500 years. Ubein Kol Rakia LeRakia Mahalech Chamesh Me'ot Shana. And between each level of the firmament, okay, another 500 years. V'chein bein kol rakia l'rakia, and likewise between every other level of the firmament. Ach el Shaul tored el Yarkatei Bor. And if we're talking about the opposite, okay, that one goes down to Sheol, okay, the depths of the earth, how is it possible then for one to get up so high? This shows again that the thickness of the firmament is much higher. Tiyuvta. And therefore, again, this becomes a proof text against the measure we saw before, where they said that the thickness of the firmament is only 1,000 parsecs. Right. Now, as we continue, I just want to quickly point out this idea of multiple levels of the firmament, right, is again, scientifically, if we look at it, a rather interesting idea to see that the Chachamim had this concept. Okay, as we say today, there's the, atmosphere, stratosphere, troposphere, etc., etc. Okay?
But this is all still based on the sun,
right,
moving around the earth.
Correct. Okay. Now, as we continue with the Gemara, thank you for pointing that out, Ted. Okay, because as we continue, we're going to see that the Gemara proceeds to tell us that already at this time there were different views as to what was happening in that regard. Okay. That the Gentile scholars had one view and that the rabbis had another view, but not all the rabbis agreed to the rabbinic view. Some did accept the view of the Gentile scholars. And we're going to see that in just a moment. Okay, let's go on now. Tanu Rabbanan. Chachmei Yisrael, the sages of Israel, Omrim say, Galgal Kavua, okay, that the, let's say, planet Earth was fixed, Umazalot Chozrin, and that the constellations, the stars, went around the planet Earth. V'chachmei umot ha'olam omrim, and the sages of the Gentiles, okay, say, Galgal Choser, that the planet Earth goes around, returns, Umazalot Kivuim, and that the constellations were fixed. Now, Amar Rebbe, Tshuva Ledivreihim, Rebbe had the following answer, Me'olam lo matzinu agla b'darom va'akrav b'tzafon. Rebbe is saying that we never found Ursa Major in the south and Scorpio in the north, which already tells us something to what degree Rebbe apparently was familiar with aspects of astronomy. Okay. Oh. Matkif Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. Along comes another sage, okay, who challenges and says as follows: V'dilma kibotzina di reiche. Okay, namely, maybe what we're trying to describe is something like a steel socket of a mill. Okay, in other words, remember the mills were such that they had something in the middle and the mill wheel went around it. Okay? Inami, or perhaps we would describe it as follows. Kitsinora dudasha, like the pivot of a door. Okay? In other words, the door, okay? And think of a door that would swing. Okay? Right? Like what you used to have, I mean, some restaurants, right? Have, right?
Swinging doors between the kitchen and the
Yeah,
dining.
exactly. So the Gemara continues. Chachmei Yisrael omrim, biyom chama mahalechet lamata min harakia. The sages of Israel said that during the day, the sun would travel underneath the firmament, ubalayla lamala min harakia, and then come back above the firmament. Okay? So already they knew that the sun traveled in different directions. V'chachmei umot ha'olam omrim, and the sages of the nations said, biyom chama mahalechet lamata min harakia, that during the day the sun traveled below the firmament, ubalayla lamata min hakarka, and at night it traveled below the earth. Now, why is that? Amar Rebbe. Rebbe tries to give a response. V'nir'in divreihem mi divreinu. And there, says Rebbe's statements seem more, for the moment, reasonable than ours. Shebiyom, that during the day, mayanot tsonanim, okay, that the springs, in other words, springs of water are cold, ubalayla rotchim, and at night, okay, springs can be warm. In other words, if the sun were to go through the earth and warm from underneath, okay, remember they're familiar with the hot springs that are in various areas. Tanya, but we now have a Braita. Rabbi Natan Omer, again, Biyamot hachama, during the winter months, chama mahalechet begova shel rakia, okay, that the sun travels at the height of the firmament. Lefichach kol ha'olam kulo roteach. For that reason, the entire world is hot. Umayanot tzonanin, and the springs are cold. Biyamot hageshamim, during the rainy months. Okay, so in other words, during the winter, right? Chama mahalechet, the sun travels. B'shipulei rakia, the lower part of the firmament. Lefichach kol ha'olam kulo tzonein, and therefore, okay, the entire world is cold. Umayanot rotchin, and the springs are warm, are hot. Another Braita, Tanu Rabbanan says this Braita, Ba'arba'a shvilin chama mahalechet. The sun travels in 4 paths, or 4, let's use the word paths for a moment, right? Namely, Nisan, Iyar, Vesiva, during these months, mahalechet baharim, it travels past the mountains, kadei lefasher et hashlagin, in order to melt the snows. Tammuz, Av, Ve'elu, okay, as we move into the summer months, right? Mahalechet b'yishuv, it travels past the inhabited areas of the planet, kadei levashel et haperot, in order to ripen produce. Tishrei mar cheshvan b'kislev, as we move into the fall, mahalechet b'yamim, it travels over the seas, kadei liyavesh et hanaharot, in order to dry up the rivers. In other words, it begins to absorb some of the air from the water
Up
from
into
the ocean.
Up into the, right.
Tevet Shvat Va'adar, coming into this time. Mahalechet Bamidbar, it travels over the deserts. Shelo liyavesh et hazra'im, in order not to dry up the seeds that people have planted. Okay. Well, that ends our discussion of science for today. Okay. In terms of the sun, pattern of the sun, the seasons, the stars, things like that. But you could see where, if you do it, we'll have to look to see if Talmudology has an interesting piece on this. Okay. Now we're back to our Mishnah. Okay. Remember we said, what was the definition of derech rechoka? Okay. Ula had suggested that it was actually distance from one city, Modin, to Yerushalayim, in time to get there for the beginning of slaughtering Korban Pesach, which was midday. Rabbi Eliezer made a different suggestion. His argument was it was the question of getting inside the Azara. In other words, from the distance from the threshold of the Azara. And we looked at that and we said, was it the outermost, the women's courtyard, or was it really the Azara, the temple precinct itself? So let's go on. The Afal Gav de Matse Ayil, and even though it's possible that we find that someone could come in, V'lo Amrinam Le Kum Ayil, we don't find that him saying to him, come and enter. Vahatanya. But aren't we taught elsewhere in a Braita? Yehudi Arel, Shalom Mal, Anosh Karet. That a non-circumcised Jew, okay, who has not done circumcision before the time of eating the Korban Pesach, right? Anush karet is going to be punished with karet. This is Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. This is the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Now, how can he say that on the one hand, and previously say that the whole question of distance is whether or not you can simply get into the Azara? Amar Abaye. Says Abaye, derech rechoka letahor, ve'ein derech rechoka letamei. Abaye says, I will use Ula's definition and say when we talked about far distance, that was only in regard to somebody who was tahor. We don't apply the criteria of distance to somebody who's tamei. And somebody who's tamei then cannot enter into the Azara. Rava Amar, Tana'aihi. According to Rava, this is a machloket Tanaim, the Tanya, because we teach in a Braita. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, says Rabbi Eliezer, Ne'emar richuk b'makom Pesach. Namely, we talk about distance in regards to the situation of Pesach. V'ne'emar richuk b'makom b'ma'aser. And we also discuss the issue of distance when we're dealing with the topic of maaser, of tithing, namely, ma lahalan chutz la'achilato, where there we talk about something being outside the venue of being able to eat. Remember, because we have to bring maaser to Yerushalayim. If we can't bring the produce, we bring the money, and then we buy food and eat it there in Yerushalayim. Afkan chutz la'achilato. So likewise here, it must mean outside the area of being able to eat. Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mishum Rabbi Eliezer.
What's this?
He says the following, Chutz la'asiyato, that it means that it's outside his possibility of doing it, of bringing, of having the korban slaughtered, sprinkled, and being able to be eaten. Kiman azlaha da'ama Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yosef. According to whom did he base this on? Namely, like that of Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, Rav Yosef, b'tmeim, with regarding those people who were tamei, halach achar rov ha'omdim ba'azara. In other words, all of those people that were waiting in, let's say, in the women's courtyard and could not get past the Nicanor gate into the Azara, if the majority of them were tamei, then they would consider slaughtering the Korban Pesach in a status of Tuma. Kiman, according to whom? Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, She'amar mishum Rabbi Eliezer, who said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, Amar lo Rabbi Yossi, lefichach v'chuli. Okay. Now, get to the new piece of the Mishnah. New piece. Amar lo Rabbi Yossi lefichach. Okay? The following. Tanya says this brighter. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, what did he say? Derech. It referred to road. Shomea ani mahalech shnayim o shlosha yamim. I would have learned, he said, that this meant that when it says the road, it means he's at I'm going to say a considerable distance of, say, maybe 2 or 3 days of travel. Keshehu omer uba derech. But when the pasuk says on the road, and lo uba derech lo haya, that he wasn't on the road, magid sheme eskupat ha'azara ulechutz karui derech. That this seems to tell us that here too we can say that from the threshold of the temple precinct all the way out, okay, is considered the road on the way to
Derech, right.
right? So we're going to stop there, okay, before we get into the new Mishnah, because that Mishnah is going to start again dealing with again other aspects of what's different between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni. Okay?
Okay.
So I'll look over the Gemara a little more and see how we can juggle things for later in the week. All right?
Okie doke.
All right, guys.
Thank you,
Everybody
Rabbi.
Good day, everyone.
take care. Stay
Yeah.
well. Just reminding
Thank you very
everybody
much.
of lunch and learn at 12:15 with Rabbi Loomis.